At my sister's engagement party, 50 guests, string quartet, champagne tower, my father lifted his glass and called me out in front of everyone. But to understand what happened that night, you have to understand what my family is, what it has always been, because the party wasn't the beginning of this story. It was just the night everything that had been building for 27 years finally broke the surface. My grandfather, Robert James Patterson, opened Patterson and Associates in the fall of 1962. He had $200, a second-hand desk from a church rummage sale in South Philadelphia, and a law degree from Temple University that he'd earned by working nights at a printing press for 3 years straight. The office was a single room above a dry cleaner on Walnut Street. He shared a secretary with the dentist next door. When it rained hard, the ceiling leaked, and he kept a mop behind his filing cabinet. He used to tell this story at every family Christmas. Not to complain, he never complained about those years, but because he wanted us to understand where we came from. He'd sit in the wingback chair by the fireplace, the one with the armrest worn smooth from decades of use, and he'd say the same thing every time. A man who knows where he started never forgets what things cost. By 1975, Patterson and Associates had 4 attorneys and a proper suite on the 4th floor of a building that didn't leak. By 1985, 8 attorneys and a conference room with a mahogany table that seated 12. My grandfather retired in 1991 and handed the firm to my father, Mitchell Patterson, who had graduated from Harvard Law in 1978 and spent the next 13 years proving he deserved to inherit it. My father grew it to 15 attorneys. He added a second location. He built the kind of client list that gets mentioned in law review articles: corporate defense, high-stakes civil litigation, a few criminal cases that made the Philadelphia Inquirer. He also served on 3 municipal boards, chaired a legal aid committee, and developed a handshake that made people feel simultaneously greeted and dismissed. The waiting room of the Patterson firm is the first thing I remember about my father's professional life. My mother used to bring Olivia and me there on school holidays when she had no other childcare. We would sit in the chairs along the wall, blue upholstered, very firm, the kind of chairs designed to communicate seriousness rather than comfort, and look at the photographs. There were 8 of them when I was a child, framed in matching dark wood, arranged in 2 rows on the wall directly across from the reception desk. Each one had a small brass plate engraved with a name and year. My grandfather in 1962, 31 years old, standing in front of the original office in a suit that was a size too big in the shoulders. My grandfather again in 1975, at the new office, looking slightly less young and slightly more certain. My father at Harvard, his diploma still in the sleeve. My father at a City Bar Association gala in 1997. And at the end of the second row, added after Olivia's Penn Law graduation in 2016, Olivia Ann Patterson, JD, Penn Law, magna cum laude. 8 photographs, 3 generations of Pattersons, all of them lawyers, all of them looking directly at the camera with the same expression, certain, composed, already arrived. I always knew there would never be a 9th for me. My father never said it directly. That was never how it worked in our house. The way values got transmitted in the Patterson family was through proximity and absence, through what was praised at dinner and what was passed over in silence, through which accomplishments made my father set down his briefcase and pay attention, and which ones received a polite nod and a redirect to something more interesting. What he praised: academic achievement in subjects that led somewhere useful, debate club, mock trial, Olivia's LSAT scores, the acceptance letter from Penn Law that he had framed and hung in his private office. What he passed over in silence: my grade school science fair entry, which placed 2nd in the regional competition, the short story that won honorable mention in a statewide contest, my interest in biology. The afternoon I spent at 14 volunteering at a community health clinic, and came home and told my parents it was the first time I'd ever felt like I was doing something that actually mattered. My mother nodded when I said that. My father said, "That's very admirable, Stephanie," and passed the potatoes to Olivia. It wasn't cruelty. I want to be precise about this because it's important. My father is not a cruel man. He is a man who built a very specific idea of what success looks like, and he cannot see past it. He looks at the world through a template that was handed to him by his father, who got it from his father, and the template says, a Patterson becomes a lawyer. A Patterson joins the firm. A Patterson adds their photograph to the wall. Everything outside that template registers to him as noise. I registered as noise. I figured out I wanted to be a nurse when I was 14 years old, in a hospital waiting room. My grandmother had a cardiac episode that spring, not ultimately fatal, but serious enough that she spent 4 days at Jefferson Hospital while they adjusted her medications. I visited her once alone, taking the bus from school because my mother had a court appearance she couldn't reschedule. We talked for 2 hours, not about law, not about the firm, not about grades or achievements, but about what she was actually afraid of, about her husband who had died 15 years earlier, about what it felt like to be sick and surrounded by strangers. At one point, a nurse came in to check her vitals, a woman named Carla, calm in a way that seemed to come from somewhere deep and practiced, and my grandmother watched her go and said, "Those are the ones who keep the whole thing running." I rode the bus home that evening and felt something click into place inside me that I didn't have a word for yet. I let the idea live in me quietly for 2 years, until the conversation could no longer be avoided. I had done enough research by then to know exactly which program I wanted: Penn Nursing, affiliated with a major hospital system, one of the best in the region, not a consolation, a deliberate choice. I told my parents at dinner in October of my senior year. My father set down his fork. My mother said his name in a warning tone and then fell silent. Then she said what she said about the Hendersons, family friends, lawyers. Their daughter had just been accepted to Yale Law. The implication was clear without being stated. What would we tell people? I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. I had stated my intention. They had responded with the only vocabulary they had. We all understood each other perfectly. Penn Nursing accepted me in April. I opened the letter alone, standing at the kitchen counter, my parents at work, and the house quiet. I read it 3 times, and then I sat down on the kitchen floor and allowed myself to be happy about it for as long as I wanted, with no one watching. That part was mine. It has always been mine. I have been a registered nurse at Jefferson Hospital for 5 years. I work nights, 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning, 3 or 4 times a week by choice. I requested the night shift because that's where the work is quietest and most essential. During the day, there are doctors and family members and administrators. At night, it's mostly just the nurses and the patients. I walk an average of 6 miles per shift. My sneakers last about 4 months before the soles wear through. My mother once offered to get me something more polished. The sneakers are equipment, not fashion. I need to be able to run when someone's pressure drops, and I need to be able to do it for 12 hours without my feet giving out. On a typical night, I am responsible for 5 to 6 patients. I manage their medications, monitor for post-surgical complications, field calls from physicians when something changes at 3 in the morning, make judgment calls with direct consequences for whether someone lives or dies, without the luxury of a second opinion in the room with me. But the clinical description misses most of it. It's the 83-year-old man who spent the first 3 nights awake because the hospital made him feel like he'd been stored rather than cared for. I sat with him for 20 minutes on my break, just sat, not doing anything clinically useful, just being a person in the room while he talked about his wife, who had died 2 years before, and about the house he was afraid he was going to lose. I didn't fix any of that. But the next morning, his daughter called to say he'd slept through the night for the first time since admission. It's the 44-year-old woman recovering from surgery who asked me at 3 in the morning whether she was still going to be herself on the other side of this. Not a medical question, a human one. I sat on the edge of her bed and told her what I actually believed. She cried. I handed her tissues. I came back twice more that shift, not because her vitals required it, but because she did. I have held the hands of people who were dying when there was no one else in the room. I have been the last face some people saw. My father calls this personally fulfilling. He means it to sound smaller than it is. In the spring of last year, I won the Nurse of the Year award at my hospital. 1 nurse out of 320 on staff, selected through nominations from patients, families, and physicians. I sent the invitation to our family group chat 6 weeks in advance. My father responded 11 hours later. Stephanie, I have a prior commitment that evening. The prior commitment was a bar association dinner. Not an emergency, a preference. My mother sent a text 3 days later. So proud of you, sweetheart. We'll celebrate soon. We never celebrated. I went to the ceremony alone. When they called my name and I walked to the stage, the applause was warm and genuine and completely impersonal. I stood behind the podium and held a crystal plaque with my name on it and looked out at an audience full of people who didn't know me. I am telling you this not for sympathy. I am telling you so you understand exactly how long this had been going on before the night of the party and exactly what I had learned to carry alone. I met Jake 18 months before the party at the Wayne County Farmers Market on a Saturday morning in late August. His booth was at the far end of the market. A folding table, a cooler, brown paper packages of grass-fed beef, a hand-lettered sign, Shaw Family Farm, EST 1924. He was wearing a faded green flannel with worn elbows, and he was talking to an older woman who had extremely specific questions about grass-feeding practices, which he was answering with complete seriousness. When she moved on, he looked at me and said, "What can I get you?" I said I didn't cook a lot of beef. He asked what I did cook. I told him, chicken mostly, pasta when I didn't have the energy for anything more complicated. He asked what left me low on energy. I said I was a nurse, night shifts, 3 or 4 times a week. He said, "Most people ask what you do for a living. You told me what you do that costs you something. That's different." We talked for 20 minutes. He wrote his number on the paper bag with a Sharpie in his shirt pocket. Our first real date was 2 weeks later at a diner in West Philadelphia with vinyl booths and pancakes the size of dinner plates. We talked for 4 hours. Over 18 months, small things accumulated that didn't quite fit the story I'd been telling about him. A MacBook Pro, top of the line, sitting on his kitchen table beside worn paperwork. An email notification I caught once. Grant proposal review. Shaw Foundation board meeting. He redirected gently and I let it go. A phone call overheard from the next room. Tell the board I'll review the applications by Thursday. The rural clinic expansion takes priority. The way he spoke, precise, deliberate. The particular precision of someone accustomed to rooms where the wrong word has consequences. I didn't push. The honest reason was that it didn't matter to me. My family had spent my entire life measuring people by what they could prove. Degrees, titles, salaries. I had watched them turn worth into a ledger. I didn't want to do that. Jake didn't owe me his resume. He showed me who he was. I decided that was enough. I was right. I just didn't know yet how right. My parents met Jake for the first time at a Sunday dinner in November, 4 months after we'd started dating. He wore a clean button-down and brought a good burgundy, which my mother accepted with a smile and set aside to open something else. My father arrived from his study, shook Jake's hand with the handshake that greets and dismisses simultaneously, said "good to meet you" in the tone of completing a required task, and sat down. 20 minutes into dinner, he asked what the farm was like. Jake answered honestly. My father said, "And that's sustainable financially?" He said it the way someone says it when they've already decided the answer is no. Jake said, "It works for us." My father said, "I see," and turned to Olivia to ask about a case she was working. Jake finished his dinner. He passed the potatoes when they were needed. He talked to my grandmother about the radiator that had been giving her trouble. He helped clear the table without being asked and said nothing about any of it on the drive home. On the drive home, I asked what he thought of my family. He said, "Your father is a man who has decided what things mean." He said it without malice, like a description description of weather. My parents never asked a follow-up question about Jake after that dinner. In 18 months, not one. Not about the farm, not about what he cared about, not about whether he made me happy. They looked at the boots and the truck and the word farmer and decided there was nothing further worth knowing. Olivia got engaged in February. Philip Ashford had proposed in Lisbon, planned for months. She called me the morning after, still in Portugal, her voice high and bright in a way I hadn't heard from her in a long time. I sat on my couch in my pajamas at 7 in the morning and was genuinely happy for her. The engagement party was announced 3 weeks later. My parents insisted on the Whitman estate. 50 guests, seated dinner, string quartet, champagne tower. My invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning with a handwritten note from Olivia at the bottom. So happy you'll be there. Bring Jake. The family group chat began immediately. My mother, please remind him about the dress code. My father, 2 hours later, cocktail attire. No exceptions. Neither of them said hello. 11 days before the party, I went to my parents' house to pick up a dress my mother had bought for me. She was upstairs when I arrived. I let myself in with my key and stood in the entryway waiting. The kitchen door was half open. I heard my mother's voice, businesslike, on the phone, regarding the seating for Saturday, table 9, near the rear exit, for Stephanie Patterson and guest. Simple placement. They won't be staying for the full evening, I expect. I went completely still. She continued. For the formal introductions, please focus on the immediate family. Olivia, Philip, both sets of parents. We don't need anything more complicated than that for the program. I waited until she finished the call. Then I walked into the kitchen. She turned with a smile that went slightly rigid at the edges. Stephanie, you're here. Table 9? I said. The seating arrangement, she said. We're still finalizing. You told the planner we wouldn't be staying for the full evening. A beat. Stephanie, there are 50 guests. I heard you, I said. We looked at each other for a long moment. Something had shifted. Something in me had shifted, cleanly and completely, in the seconds I'd stood at that kitchen door. I handed the dress back. I'll wear my own. And I left without trying it on. That night, I told Jake what I'd heard. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, do you want to skip it? No, I said. I want to go. I want to exist in that room, even from table 9. I want them to have to see me. And then I told him the truth I hadn't finished articulating even to myself. I'm not going to prove something. I'm going to say goodbye to the version of me that kept waiting for them to change. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, then we'll go, and we'll be there. The Whitman estate sits at the end of a long private drive in a part of the city that was built to make an impression and has been succeeding at it for 140 years. Stone facade, tall windows, manicured gardens, a fountain in the courtyard. The kind of place that appears in engagement announcements in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Jake drove. He'd worn dark slacks and a white button-down. Pressed. I wore a navy dress, my grandmother's pearl earrings. We arrived at exactly 7, the stated start time, not the fashionably late arrival my parents considered appropriate. I didn't particularly care about giving them the satisfaction of an entrance. They were near the door. My mother in a champagne gown, her pearl bracelet catching the light. My father in tailored charcoal, posture doing the thing it does at formal events, communicating not just confidence, but architectural certainty, as if the room had been designed to hold him. When they saw us, my mother's smile widened and went rigid at the edges. Oh, you're here. She kissed my cheek. She looked at Jake. And Daniel, she said, because she had never once gotten his name right on the first try. Jake, I said. Yes, of course. Jake, she corrected herself. She offered her hand. My father nodded. Brief. Then, behind us, Judge Ashford and his wife were arriving, and my father's face transformed. Henry and Sarah, so wonderful. And he stepped past us with the warmth he reserved for people who mattered. Jake and I walked into the main room. It was extraordinary in the way only well-funded events can be. Round tables with white linens and floral centerpieces that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. String lights at a height that made the space feel both grand and intimate. The string quartet in the corner. A champagne tower near the entrance. 4 tiers, the kind of centerpiece that gets photographed. The seating chart was mounted on a gold-framed board near the bar, written in calligraphy. I read it the way you read a document that confirms something you already knew. Table 1. Olivia Patterson, Philip Ashford, Judge Henry Ashford, Sarah Ashford, Dr. Mitchell Patterson, Judge Laura Patterson. Tables 2 through 7, the legal circle, the physicians, the city council member, the people worth impressing. Table 8, distant relatives from Ohio. Table 9, Stephanie Patterson, Jake Merritt, 2 of Olivia's old college friends she hadn't spoken to in years. The table was in the far right corner, nearest the kitchen exit. No calligraphy on the name cards, no floral centerpiece, just a pillar candle and some eucalyptus. The chairs were the same as every other table, which was the only democratic thing about the arrangement. Jake looked at the chart, looked at me, put his hand on my lower back and said nothing. He never performs his feelings. He just adjusts and keeps moving. We sat. From table 9, I had a clear view of table 1. My parents were already in full form. My mother leaning toward Philip's father, laughing at everything he said. My father angled toward the judge with the posture of a man who is genuinely enjoying a conversation and also tracking every advantage in it. Olivia and Philip were beside each other, her hand in his, the two of them quietly radiant. My father's toast started the way all his toasts start, controlled, warm in that practiced way. He spoke about legacy, about what it means to build something that lasts. He looked at Olivia with genuine pride, and I don't begrudge her that. She had earned it. Every year of the work had earned it. He spoke about Philip, about 2 families whose values had aligned so completely that this moment felt inevitable. Then his eyes found me. The shift was subtle enough that anyone who didn't know him would have missed it. A small relaxation of the performed warmth into something more like an opportunity. I also want to acknowledge, he said, that families contain different paths. The room waited. He said, my younger daughter Stephanie, and gestured vaguely toward our corner, chose a different road. She's a nurse. He paused just long enough to let the word sit. A respectable profession, certainly. I'm sure she finds it fulfilling. A few more seconds of deliberate quiet. Someone near table 5 shifted in their seat. He looked directly at me. The smile was still present. It was doing a lot of work. And you're still with that farmer, aren't you, Stephanie? Almost fond, like asking about a hobby. Still in love with that poor farmer? Silence. Just a beat. And then a couple of nervous laughs from the middle of the room. The laughs of people who weren't sure if this was light teasing or something else and were hedging their bets. 50 heads turned to look at table 9. I picked up my fork, cut a piece of salmon, put it in my mouth, and chewed. My hands were completely steady. I had spent 27 years learning to be steady around my father, and that steadiness had cost me something. But it also meant that in the moment when everyone in the room was watching me to see what I would do, I gave them nothing. I sat at table 9 and ate my salmon, and the room had to wait. Then Jake stood up. No dramatic scrape of the chair, no raised voice. He simply rose to his full height, slowly, the way you stand up in church. Deliberate, unhurried, like he had every right to be upright in that room while everyone else was sitting. The room noticed. Chairs turned slightly. Cross conversations at adjacent tables broke off. My father had been refilling his glass. He stopped. He looked at Jake with the expression of a man who has decided to find something mildly amusing. Is there something you'd like to add? Jake looked at my father with an expression I hadn't quite seen on him before. Not cold, not angry, but absolutely unimpressed. The expression of a man who has been in rooms of serious people and found them disappointing before. Before he could speak, a sound came from table 1. A chair being pushed back, hard, sudden, scraping against the parquet floor. The sound cut through the room like a dropped glass. Everyone heard it. Everyone turned. Judge Henry Ashford was standing, not because he'd been asked to. He pushed back his chair with the urgency of someone reacting to something they hadn't expected to see, and he stood at table 1 and stared across the room at table 9. At Jake. He stared the way you stare when you're in a room you expected to be one thing and suddenly realize it is something else entirely. When your brain and your eyes are having an argument and your eyes are winning. My father said, "Henry." There was something in his voice I hadn't heard before, something slightly uncertain. The judge didn't look at him. He walked from table 1 to table 9, crossing the entire length of the room. People stepped back slightly, instinctively, creating a path. 50 people going quiet, while a federal judge crossed a room with the focused intention of a man who has just understood something important. He stopped in front of our table. He looked at Jake for a long moment, long enough that the room was holding its breath without knowing it was doing so. Then he said, in a voice barely above conversational level, but that carried in the silence perfectly, "Jake Merritt?" Jake nodded. Once, small, contained. The judge exhaled. He said, "I thought that was you. I didn't trust myself at first." He shook his head slightly, something between disbelief and wry recognition. "What are you doing at table 9? Jake looked at him with the small, dry expression I knew meant he found something genuinely funny, but wasn't going to perform the amusement. "I was placed here," he said, quietly. The judge turned to face my father. My father was standing now. He had risen at some point in the last 30 seconds, his champagne glass still raised at the angle of a toast that had nowhere left to land. Whatever warmth Judge Ashford had worn all evening was gone. "Mitchell." The judge said my father's name the way he would say it in a courtroom. Precisely. Wait, do you know who this man is? My father's smile was still in place, but it was working very hard. "He's Stephanie's," he started. The judge cut him off, not rudely, completely. "This is Jake Merritt, chairman of the Merritt Family Foundation, one of the 3 or 4 largest rural health trusts in the eastern United States." He turned briefly to include the room, not performing, just acknowledging reality. 11 hospitals, 47 rural clinics across 9 states. He turned back to my father. "I have been trying to get this man to sit on my federal advisory council for the better part of 2 years. Every time I reach out, he declines." The room was absolutely still. The string quartet had stopped, I'm not sure when. At table 4, a physician my mother had invited said quietly, "The Merritt Foundation. They funded the new East Wing at our hospital," said to the person beside her, but in that silence, everyone heard. From table 6, an attorney. "The Rural Nursing Scholarship Program. That was Merritt." Someone in the middle, $18 million in infrastructure last year. The judge looked at Jake. "He has turned down board seats at 3 Fortune 500 companies in 4 years. He turned down a seat on the governor's health advisory committee. He keeps turning things down because he says the work matters more than the titles." He looked at my father with the patience of a man who has heard too many weak arguments in his courtroom. "You," he said, seated his girlfriend at the table nearest the kitchen exit. The room made a sound, not a gasp, something less dramatic but more lasting. The sound of 50 people absorbing something they would be talking about for a long time. My father opened his mouth. His champagne glass was still raised. He said, "We didn't," and then stopped. The judge said, "You called him poor." Those 4 words, in that room, with that silence behind them, were enough. Jake and I left 20 minutes later. Not immediately. We sat at table 9 while the room tried to reassemble itself from the wreckage of the last 10 minutes. And then, when things had settled enough that our leaving wouldn't feel like a continuation of the drama, I set my napkin on the table and looked at him. He nodded once. We stood up. We said a brief goodnight to Olivia. She caught my hand and held it a moment longer than necessary, her eyes saying what her voice couldn't manage in that room, and we walked out through the tall front doors and into the cool evening air and down the private drive to where Jake had parked the truck. The drive home was quiet. Eventually, Jake said, "How are you doing?" I thought about it. Then I said, "I think I'm actually okay." He said, "You didn't say anything in there." I said, "I didn't need to." He drove. After a moment, he said, "The judge did that himself." "He did," I said. "I didn't know he was going to. I didn't know any of that." "I know," Jake said. I said, "You should have told me." Long pause. Then, "I know. I wanted to." And I believed him. Because I also knew why he hadn't. Because Jake Merritt has spent most of his adult life in careful, deliberate obscurity, trying trying to find out whether the people who cared about him or whether they cared about the number. I had never asked about the number. That was apparently the thing. I said, "You still should have told me." He said, "Yeah," simply without defense. We didn't talk about it more that night. Some things you reach the limit of in a single conversation. What came in the weeks after the party was not something I had anticipated. I had thought of the party as an ending, the closing of a chapter. I hadn't thought of it as a beginning, but things had been set in motion that evening that moved through the world long after Jake and I had driven home. Philip came to me 10 days later, by text and then phone. He said, "Olivia and I have been talking about the wedding, about what kind of family we're joining." He said it without performance. He said, "I want to be clear that this isn't an ultimatum about you. This is about whether the people responsible for what happened understand what they did." Philip and Olivia postponed the wedding, moved the date back 8 months. Philip's father, who had already withdrawn from the advisory board he shared with my father, formally by letter, said simply, "You're handling it the right way." My father lost 2 clients in the weeks that followed. Not small ones. Combined, close to $1 million in annual retainer fees. One of them told him directly, "I retained you because of your reputation. I cannot work with someone who treats his own family the way I watched you treat yours." The other sent a letter through their own legal counsel. Brief final. My mother lost standing with the Women's Legal Society, of which she had been a member for 19 years, quietly removed from the planning committee for their fall luncheon. No formal statement, the kind of consequence that happens in spaces that run on reputation, where decisions are made in rooms you're not invited to. Olivia called me 12 days after the party. Her voice was different, not the polished voice she uses professionally, but something underneath it, the voice of someone who has decided to say the true thing regardless of how it lands. She said, "I've known for years what was happening. Every time I watched them dismiss you, I told myself it wasn't my place. I prioritized keeping things smooth over telling the truth. I let them treat you the way they did because it was easier than fighting them about it. I let her say all of it. When she finished, I asked, 'Is that what you believe, or is it what Philip asked you to say?' Long silence. Then, both. I believe all of it. He just made me find the words. I told her I'd think about it. I believed her. Not because she said the right things, but because I know my sister well enough to hear the difference between the words that are performed and the words that cost something." My parents called separately, 2 days apart. My mother first, her voice careful and uncertain in a way I hadn't heard from her before. Then my father, his voice stripped of the practiced warmth, something more exposed underneath. They both said the same essential thing. "We were wrong. We understand we were wrong. We want to try." I went to their house on a Tuesday evening. Jake offered to come. I told him this was something I needed to do alone. The house looked the same as always. My mother opened the door before I rang the bell. She was wearing her home clothes, not the pearl bracelet, not the performance. I noticed the absence the way you notice the absence of something you've been conditioned to look for. My father stood when I came in. He doesn't always do that. The standing felt significant in the way small gestures become significant when they're coming from someone who doesn't offer them easily. Olivia was on the couch. She gave me the small, contained smile of someone who is hoping and not assuming. We sat. My mother had made tea. Nobody had touched it. My father said, "I've been trying to find the right words for 3 weeks. He said it plainly, not as a setup, not as performance. "I want to be honest with you. I'm not certain I have them yet, but I want to try." He said, "What I said at the party, the way I characterized your work, the way I introduced Jake, the implication behind the question, all of it was wrong. I was performing for that room, trying to establish a hierarchy I was comfortable with, and I did it at your expense, at his expense. That was wrong." I said, "You've been doing it for 27 years, Dad, not just at the party." He said, "Yes, I know." My mother said, "We both have." Her voice was quiet in a way I hadn't heard. "We told ourselves we were guiding you, but we were measuring you against something that was ours, not yours. And when you didn't fit the measurement, we made you invisible. I can't undo that. I can only tell you I understand it now." The room was quiet. I looked up at the wall of photographs, the 8 frames, 3 generations in suits with diplomas at their moments of official arrival. I had counted them so many times in this room, in that waiting room, in every space my family had decorated with evidence of what they valued. I said, "There's never been a photo of me on that wall." My mother looked at the photographs. She said, "No, there hasn't." I said, "I won Nurse of the Year last spring, 320 staff. I sent the invitation to the family chat 6 weeks before. You said you had a prior commitment, a bar association dinner, not an emergency, a preference." My mother sent a text the next day that said we'd celebrate soon. We never celebrated. My father closed his eyes briefly. "Yes, we never celebrated," I said again, not because I needed to repeat it, because it needed to be in the room, in words, in the air between us rather than stored in me where it had been living for a year. "I'm not here to accept an apology and go back to the way things were," I said, because the way things were was not acceptable, and going back to it would just mean accepting it again. He said, "What are you asking for?" I said, "I'm asking for something I've never had from you. I'm asking you to see me, not the version of me you wished I'd been, not the nurse in the context of it being a reasonable choice for someone who couldn't manage law school. Me, the actual person who has been in your family for 27 years and has been trying to earn your attention for most of them." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I want to hear about your patients. I've never asked about them. What is it like when you're with someone who's dying? What is that actually like?" It was the first time in 27 years my father had asked me that question, or anything like it. I told him about the 83-year-old man who couldn't sleep, the 44-year-old woman at 3 in the morning, the 19-year-old who was terrified and ashamed and needed someone to tell him it was okay to ask for help, the hands I have held when there was no one else in the room, the 6 miles per shift, the sneakers, what all of it adds up to when you hold it far enough away to see the shape. He listened, not the way he listens in a meeting, calculating the angle. He listened the way people listen when they've decided something matters and they don't know yet how much. When I finished, he said, "You were right. What you do is not a consolation. It's essential." The way I spoke about it, I am ashamed of how I spoke about it. I stated the terms, monthly family therapy, starting the following week. A therapist I had already selected and already booked. I was not asking permission. I said, "If you can't sit in that room and hear the truth of what the last 27 years have actually been, not your version of it, not your intentions, but the experience on the receiving end, then I'll attend family gatherings when I have to, and I'll be civil, and that's all." My father said, "We'll go." My mother said, "Whatever you need." Olivia said, "I'll be there." At the door, my father said my name. I turned. He said, "I don't have a way to give you back the time." He stopped. He is not a man who has practiced saying things he doesn't know how to finish, but I'm going to try. I said, "I know," and I left. Jake was parked at the end of the block, engine off. He looked up from his phone when I got in. "How are you?" he said. I thought about it the way I'd been thinking about things differently lately. Actually checking, not reaching for the easy answer. I said, "I think I'm free." He looked at me for a moment. Then, yeah, I said. He started the engine. My parents and I have been in therapy for 2 months. Some weeks are hard. Some weeks something shifts. And I see my father look at me in a way I hadn't seen before. And I think, maybe. My mother said something last week that showed me the work was happening somewhere inside her even when it doesn't come out right. Olivia and Philip rescheduled the wedding 6 months from now. I'm a bridesmaid. I've been to 3 dress fittings, which is 2 more than I'd normally tolerate willingly. Jake and I talked properly about the foundation 2 weeks after the party. On his porch in the early morning with the field behind us catching the first light. He told me the shape of it. His grandfather had started it with proceeds from a land sale in 1989, and Jake had spent 15 years building it from a small regional organization into something much larger, quietly, deliberately, without wanting the title attached to the work. The reason nobody knew who he was, he said, was that he'd decided early that he wanted to be someone people chose freely, rather than someone people managed carefully because of what he was worth. I asked why he hadn't told me. He said, "Because you were the first person in a long time who hadn't needed to know. You decided who I was before you knew any of it. I wanted to keep that as long as I could." I said, "That's a little manipulative." He said, "Yes. And I'm sorry. He is still Jake. Still drives the dented Chevy. Still sells eggs at the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. Still talks to elderly customers for longer than a transaction requires. The foundation, the hospitals, the numbers, those things are real, and they are him, but they are not more him than the flannel shirts and the worn-in boots and the way he pauses before answering a question because he wants to say the true thing, not just the easy one. That is the thing my father couldn't see when he looked at him. The thing the seating chart at table 9 couldn't hold. You can put a person near the kitchen exit and face their name card in plain white cardstock, but you cannot make them smaller. They stay the size they actually are, and eventually the room finds out. Sometimes I think about my grandmother in that hospital bed, the small, frightened woman in the paper gown, and the nurse named Carla who touched her hand once and said she'd be back in an hour. My grandmother watched her leave and said, "Those are the ones who keep the whole thing running." I spent 5 years holding the hands of people who were terrified and in pain and helping them get to the other side of their fear, and nobody put a photograph of that on a wall in a law firm waiting room. But I know what it was worth. I have always known what it was worth. And now, finally, so does my father.